I'm Steve Smith, and welcome to the Lucky or Good podcast. Our podcast invites reflection and dialogue following outdoor and experiential education incidents. Why do we normally succeed and sometimes fail? What can we learn from successes, near misses, or incidents? Through non-judgmental analysis, we uncover lessons for outdoor and experiential education programs. Rather than blaming and shaming, we try to see things from our guest's perspective, asking different questions. What went well? How did their actions make sense to them at the time? And what can we learn from this for the future? We invite our listeners to imagine themselves in our guest's situation and to explore the sometimes fine line between lucky and good. I'm very excited to welcome and introduce today's guest, Dan Veenhuizen. Dan grew up skiing and climbing in the Pacific Northwest. His passion for all things snow and avalanche related has led to professional avalanche work across several sectors, including education, public safety, ski areas, and most recently, industrial projects. Dan began ski patrolling at Copper Mountain, Colorado in 2005. He then moved to Washington State and served as a patroller, avalanche dog handler, and forecaster at Stevens Pass Mountain Resort for 15 years. During that time, Dan also worked for 6 seasons as a climbing ranger for the National Park Service on both Mount Rainier and in North Cascades National Park, and as an avalanche technician for the Washington State Department of Transportation. Dan has resided in Leavenworth, Washington, and recently moved to Winthrop, Washington, where he works as an operational forecaster, recently earning a BSc in civil engineering. Congratulations on that. And Dan, thanks so much for being here today. What story would you like to share with the listeners?
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you, and thanks for that lovely introduction. The story that came to mind as we were discussing any experiences that I've had in life that either were lucky or good was one of a backcountry skiing incident that occurred in 2019. And at the time, I was working as a forecaster at Stevens Pass and was skiing frequently. So 4 days a week for work, and then usually backcountry skiing 2 or 3 of my days off. So I was out a lot and in that region. The day of the incident, I was skiing with a colleague from Stevens Pass, another avalanche professional, and we were just a couple miles from the ski resort itself. So in the Stevens Pass backcountry off Highway 2. And we had headed out that day with couple different ideas of what to do. We had a few different runs that we were looking at, and we had looked at the avalanche forecast, which was a habit of pretty much all backcountry skiers. And the avalanche hazard for that day was, I think it was rated moderate, is what I recall. I actually tried to look back on the website, and they don't have records that went back far enough, but I believe it was rated moderate. And what that means for people that aren't familiar with what the North American avalanche danger scale is, there's 5 steps, and moderate would be the second step. So the first step is low, second step is moderate. And the definition for that is that a human-triggered avalanche is possible and that natural avalanches are unlikely. The next step, at considerable human-triggered avalanches are likely. And the second piece, which will become important later to the avalanche forecast, is that the avalanche problem for the day was wind slabs. And so when they forecast for avalanches, they forecast for specific types of avalanches and how they form and how they occur. And the reason that's important for backcountry travelers is people make decisions about which runs to do, which aspects, based on the type of problem for the day and how to travel, that kind of thing. So our problem for the day was wind slab on a basically northeast through northwest aspect. And so the first run that we chose to go ski was a gully couloir feature, and we made our way up the opposite side of the mountain from the highway. It was on a south-facing slope. And then the run itself was like a northwest-facing slope. And it started with about 400 vertical feet of kind of low-angle terrain before you get into this steeper, more confined gully. So we skied that. We didn't see any obvious red flags. We were looking for wind slab problems. We didn't come across anything that made us think that we had that problem in that location. My partner and I felt comfortable skiing the line that we skied. We went down it without incident. At the bottom of that run, the option to travel up an adjacent peak and ski another similar run was there. And so that was part of our plan for the day. So we travel up the adjacent peak, again, on a opposite aspect from what we were planning to ski. And we get up to the high point here and get ourselves over to the top of the line, which is another gully couloir feature that is steeper than what we just skied, a little bit more aggressive. The line itself was kind of walled in like a chute, so you couldn't just get into it and traverse out of it. You once you chose to go into it, you were in this confined feature. So my partner skied first, and she made a few turns and wasn't leaving much of a track. Like the surface looked quite firm. And we were kind of like, okay, this is seeing a little bit of wind, and thinking maybe it was almost more wind scoured. And so the snow had been blown out of there. She made a few turns, eventually gets into some softer snow. Skiing looks great. She continues down to the bottom of the run. Then it's my turn. And so I get in and make two turns on this firm surface and then see visually the entire slope fracture below me, wall to wall between these two cliffs, and knew immediately that I had nowhere to go. There was no escape option, like I said. So the idea of skiing out of the avalanche, which people do and which I have before, wasn't really an option. Like the lower boundary of the slab that had failed was well below me. So I was basically in the moving part of snow from the beginning and didn't really have any choice in the matter. I was skiing with an avalanche airbag pack, which some people know what those are. If you don't know what that is, it's there's various models on the market, but the basic idea is that a large balloon that is part of your backpack, when you activate it with a trigger that's on your strap, inflates in a matter of seconds. And once that happens, you become functionally a larger piece of the moving pile of snow. And as the snow moves downhill, you get sorted to the top. And so that's the theory of how they work. And so in my scenario, I knew right away that I was caught and that I was going to deploy my airbag. And so I pulled the handle right away, airbag inflates, and I basically start getting tumbled immediately, lose my skis, can feel myself sort of riding in the upper layers of the snow. And so that was great, but moving quite fast and with no control over where I'm going. And there were some trees down in the run out zone, so I was a little bit worried about encountering those. The avalanche comes to a stop, and I'm about 600 vertical feet below the top of the slope, and I'm partially buried basically from the waist down. So I'm sitting with the airbag inflated behind me. I'm sitting facing downhill on the surface and can see my partner. She's down there putting her climbing skins back on, getting ready to come and search for me should that occur. Fortunately, she didn't have to do that. I was able to locate one ski off to the side, put that on, and then traverse my one ski down to the bottom where actually my other ski had done the full trip by itself. So I had both skis, which is great. Lost my poles, and we decided that that was the end of our ski day, and it was time to head back out. As we traversed around the side, we saw a similar gully feature next to us had also avalanche. So whether that natural previously or was a sympathetic event to the avalanche that I triggered, I don't know, but there was another one in that area. But we basically made our way out and skied back to the truck.
Well, as is often the case in stories like this, there's things that we can recognize that went well, and probably some things that you might want to learn from or identify for the viewers that you might do differently in the future. And so, where would you like to start with your lessons learned from this experience?
The main thing that my partner and I discussed after the incident and on the way back out is that our first run was a different slope configuration. And if you remember, I said that we skied a few hundred vertical feet of low angle terrain before we got to the actual confined gully on the first run and did not see this wind slab problem. The difference with our second run is that the chute basically originated at ridgetop and was quite steep from ridgetop. And so on the leeward side of the slope where the wind's blowing from, there was a large open area, which we call the fetch. There was a lot of space where snow could get picked up, blown over the ridgetop, and immediately deposited into the starting zone of the avalanche path. Versus our first run, it was this low angle area. So as wind is blowing through there, it's sort of dissipating. It's not really transporting a lot of snow. And so we assigned a lot of value to our observations during the first run and use
Mm,
that to inform our comfort level with terrain choice for the second run when it wasn't directly applicable in terms of the style of terrain. If that makes sense.
absolutely. Great description. It seems like you have, in hindsight, this really clear and vivid technical understanding of the physics of what happened there and how it went wrong, and it makes me wonder, why is it so clear now in hindsight And what were you seeing at the time, or what were some pressures you might be feeling, or what was going on with just with group dynamics that might have made that thing that's so clear in hindsight maybe less obviously. If you knew it was there, you wouldn't have had the avalanche, right? So what do you think, is there anything else kind of from the group dynamics or the day or how that decision making was going that led you to put so much weight on your previous experience from your day and extrapolate that to the rest of your day? I'm sure you've thought a little bit about that. Do you have any reflections on those aspects?
Yeah, it was just the two of us and,
Mm,
a good friend. And we were, I mean, there's so many heuristics that were a part of the story, but familiarity being one big one that, we were basically in our backyard of the terrain that we work in every day. And so we feel really comfortable going out in it and like we have a good pulse on what the problems are. And obviously important and all avalanche professionals do this, but even if you are in your backyard, the continual assessment of what you're seeing is very important, or else you're not gonna do this job very long. And I think once we hit, we had put some effort into that in the beginning of the day. And then as soon as we sort of got done with that first run, our conversation turned to more like life matters and just, personal things that were happening and not really talking about the conditions and what might be different about the next run that we were going to do.
mhm, mhm,
And so I think in some ways, like, being such a person that I was so comfortable with and, it was really easy for the conversation to just turn into more of a like social event rather
mhm.
than remaining focused on what the hazards might be.
And it's so interesting, right? Because first of all, I can really relate to that. I have had very similar kind of situations where two people in more of a mountaineering climbing situation, in my case, might be so comfortable with the other person's skills and experience that it might almost make the two of you together less safe than if you were there on your own, or if you were responsible perhaps for a novice in that situation. You might not have been as readily turning off that continuous assessment and that responsibility that you would be feeling. But maybe by being there with another expert, if you will, is that fair? That in some ways, ironically, may have made you both less safe. And I'm curious if that paradox, if you think that is applicable here, or am I kind of extrapolating that into your story?
No, I think I think in certain incidents, it is identified where if there's not a clear leader and no one
Hmm.
that's sort of got the responsibility for the group, that it can be easy for, in the absence of that clear leader, for no one to really take responsibility for the hazard assessment. And I think it is easy to think like, oh, well, that person's not saying anything. That person doesn't seem concerned. They're
Yeah.
experienced. If there was any red flags, they would certainly say so. And so things must be fine, you know?
It makes me think about the social proof heuristic, where you're seeing other people doing things, and surely if this wasn't safe, someone else would be speaking up, and it must be safe for me to do it. And there's this, I think that touches a little bit on this phenomenon of the two experts together, maybe having a little bit of that influence on each other, which is really interesting to see. Since you brought up heuristics, it's always such a great topic for this podcast. Are there any others that you think might apply to your story?
Yeah, the other thing I thought about is the confirmation bias, where, we seek the information that supports the conclusion that we want to have. And that was another, like after the first run, while ascending to the top of the second run, I think I was doing that. I was certainly looking at things that supported our decision to go ski that next piece of terrain.
And looking at the parts that gave you desire to keep going, or confirmed looking for the things that you wanted to see. That is giving them more weight in your decision making than looking for things that you maybe don't want to see. So, what would your advice be? What is the takeaway for you? I mean, it's easy to say try harder, care more, don't let your guard down, but humans are going to let their guard down. Humans are going to make mistakes. Humans aren't going to be perfect all the time. So I'm wondering if there are structural things, or habits or routines or something that you might want to bring into future situations like this, so that your future self, doesn't fall victim to some of those same powerful, understandable human biases that you really clearly identified.
Well, I think as a group habit, just discussing objectives clearly and defining what you're headed for next or what the next decision is, using that affirmative language and not being passive about, like, okay, well, if we're going that direction, what exactly are we talking about skiing? What's on the table? What's not? And if we are considering something different than what we just did, how is it different? Is it a different aspect? Is it different terrain configuration? Having that sort of moment of pause and trying to have that group discussion about like, hey, just checking in. Is everybody good with this? Like, here's what I'm thinking. Does that sound all
Mhm.
right? And then carrying on.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so it's a it sounds like you're talking about building some more intentional checkpoints and not drifting into that socializing space where no one is doing that. Checkpoints of intentionality along the way, perhaps. It would be something that kinda emerges for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with skiing, like a really obvious one is any transitions, like where you're going to put your skins back on and head uphill, or you have to make a decision about a left or right at a certain terrain feature or something. Like those are great opportunities to discuss, that exact thing. I think that anytime that there's a shift in the field of, either conditions or changing your terrain from what you've already been on that day to something different, that I definitely have a little more of a like red light goes off in my head to, assess like what might be different about the other place that we're going. And actually had a day with somebody this winter just a few weeks ago where they were the one that brought it up and said, hey, I just want to point out like we're shifting from skiing this aspect and this kind of terrain to this different aspect and this kind of terrain. Are we all good with that? And so it was great because I was like, yep, that's a great conversation. Thanks for bringing that up.
So that's a really good point that you're bringing up there, which is not just putting the onus on people to always be the ones to speak up or to be perfect or to initiate those conversations, but also the importance of the rest of the group being receptive and supportive and open to that kind of feedback. Or, there's an aspect of this which is leadership, and there's an aspect of this which is followership or willingness to be part of the two-way communication, that's taking place there. So that's something that's kind of emerging for me from that. Your warm and receptive and sort of positive response to that probably encourages that person to do it again or to speak up if they have concerns or to voice their observations. And as we know, like groups tend to make better decisions when you hear from all those different angles and perspectives than a single autonomous leader making decisions based on assumptions or based on their one viewpoint. So that is, something else. I think the Avalanche education community and the Avalanche research community has done such a better job with this, with the group dynamics and the whole piece around how do we actually make decisions in complex dynamic environments, and just the concept of heuristics and all that stuff kind of arises from that Avalanche community. And I wish that it penetrated more easily into other parts of outdoor recreation and adventure that experience some of those exact same phenomenons, but don't always have the terminology for it or the awareness, or it's not integrated into their community in the way that, the facets, for example, as the, acronym for heuristics is pretty well known in the avalanche world and not necessarily known by every climber that you've gone out. I'm wondering your thoughts on that piece and why has the avalanche community maybe done that better than the rest of us? What would your hope be for breaking down some of those barriers?
Great point. Why it's been so well adopted in the Avalanche community. One thing that comes to mind is actually the conferences that occur that a lot of snow safety professionals attend. So like the ISSW and the Canadian Avalanche Association Spring Conference. That's where a lot of this research gets presented and sort of trickles its way into the community from there. And I think maybe having that central depository of, where people meet every year, every couple of years and talk about it all together. Whereas I can't think of a similar thing in the climbing community or the boating community or, I guess that's the first thing that jumps out at me about why it might be working well here. And then the way that avalanche education is done, there's kind of standardized curriculum that comes from both the American Avalanche Association and the Canadian Avalanche Association. And those points are in that curriculum. And so anybody that takes an Avalanche course is going to get introduced to those concepts. And since you brought up facets and Ian McCammon, I heard a podcast that he and Sarah Boylan did not long ago, and they talk about the concept of the rolling debrief while you're in the field. And I thought that was great because, that's something that I think a lot of outdoor enthusiasts have a hard time incorporating into their day is having a debrief. A lot of times you're tired, you want to eat, you want to grab a beer, you want to get in the car and head home. And so doing that 15 minutes at the end of the day can be challenging sometimes. But, they talk about doing it as you go through the day. Like, hey, we just made this decision. How was that conversation for everybody? Like, how do we feel about ending up at this place that we're now at? Because you're out there and maybe you've got a 4-mile hike back at the end of the day and you have plenty of time to talk about how the day went. So, yeah, I thought that was an interesting concept.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Boylan and McCammon and their work. And yeah, let's normalize a continuous conversation and learn all the time instead of forcing it into some uncomfortable space where no one actually wants to talk about it, or waiting for some tragedy to occur and then spending all of our time and energy analyzing the tragedy when we could have been continuously learning all the time. And that's sort of the spirit behind the Lucky or Good podcast is this question. And the Lucky or Good question is meant to invite us curiously and humbly into a conversation, not just when things have gone tragically wrong, but when they've gone well. Were we lucky or were we good today? And were the ingredients that go into a tragic event some of the exact same things that might go into a successful day? So I think that's probably a good time for me to ask you, Dan, like looking back on your Couloir experience and slide, were you lucky or were you good?
Yeah. A little bit of both, I think. And the ways that I think that's true are, I was lucky in the sense that, once the avalanche happened and I lost control of the situation, like I could have hit a tree, I could have ended up buried. The airbag, I felt like provided some assistance. The airbag might not have worked. I might not have had one. So I think those are some ways that I was lucky to end up sitting unharmed on the surface and with pretty much all of my equipment. It's definitely lucky there. I think the good part of it was really the thing that we still did right in that situation was manage the consequences of the potential for us to be wrong about our hazard assessment. And by that, I mean, we didn't ski a line where if you fall, you're going over a giant cliff or you're ending up in a crevasse or something like that. I feel like at that part of it, at least, we still managed well. So, because the worst scenario did happen, like we did have an avalanche happen. And even with that, I was able to come out unscathed. Anytime that we're discussing a trip or a plan or something, having some sort of margin built in seems like a good plan for longevity. Even consequences that aren't necessarily physical. Maybe you're trying to build in a margin for your enjoyment of a trip. And it's like, okay, well, if that plan doesn't work out or, something outside of our control happens, how do we still have a good time or meet an objective that satisfies everyone? Yeah, I think that definitely resonates with decision making, especially, as my risk tolerance probably goes down a bit as I age, uh,
Mhm.
trying to figure out where to build in those margins and still have the experiences you want to have is increasingly important.
Any last words or takeaways from your reflections here today that you would like to share?
It's been nice to, have some probing questions from you and think more critically about it and have some things come up that maybe I hadn't thought of in that way. So thank you for that opportunity.
So one last question, Dan, that occurs to me is that it's very vulnerable and honest and kind of you to come on this podcast and share your incident. Some might say, an error that you made as an avalanche safety professional, and that some people might not be as forthcoming or as willing as you are to share your story so that others can benefit from it. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for other folks who might be less willing than yourself to share their stories as professionals.
Yeah. I think that I tried very hard to adopt that mindset when I took the position of assistant forecaster at Stevens Pass. And at the time, there was a lot of conversation about near miss reporting, is sort of how things were being termed. And how do we incentivize that? How do we get people to talk about their mistakes? And I heard a lot of different ideas about how to do that. And I think there are a lot of ways to do it. But for me, in my role, I felt like the best thing I could do is to talk to the people that I worked with about my mistakes. And that seemed like it made it really easy culturally for everyone to talk about their mistakes. And so I think I just decided that that's what I was going to do. And it was almost kind of this thing where by doing that and being vulnerable, the what I would get back from people was their stories and ways that they had also made mistakes, and people would come to me privately and tell me about something that had happened that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. So it really ended up going both ways, and I think I've just tried to carry that forward.
Well, I think it's a brilliant approach, and I'm curious if that was that based on some sort of research that you did, or did that come from your snow safety conference, or where did you land on that?
Actually, by seeing other people do it and seeing that when people did that, that the response they got was more of the same back to them. And I said, oh, that seems like it works, instead of like, hey, we're going to, have a pizza party every time we get this many incidents reported, or, people drop their report in the shoebox and we draw one and you get a prize. And I mean, those things may also be effective to some degree, but it seemed like what I witnessed was that this other approach seemed to work better.
I love it. And I've seen the opposite in some cases where people get a pizza party at the end of the month for no incidents that were reported that month. 257 days since our last incident. Like, really? Is it true? Or is it
Yeah.
that many pizzas that got consumed by not talking about what's really happening in the
Yeah. No one
world? So
wants to
I
break the streak.
Yeah, who wants to be the one to speak up and say, I got hurt at work today? So I think what you're role modeling there is really important, and is, in my mind, one of the biggest takeaways that people should get from this episode. When I first started studying avalanche safety decades ago, the entire course, Avalanche 1, was focused on facets and slope angles and technical aspects of terrain and stuff like this. And if you could just say a paragraph on how the thinking has shifted in those kind of early avalanche education programs, in addition to understanding terrain and facets. I don't mean the facets heuristics, I mean the actual
Right.
snow facets. In addition
Right.
to talking about the snow science, how has Avi 1 evolved over the years?
It has gotten there's been a lot more emphasis on group dynamics and decision making and how to facilitate good conversations within the group. I think the industry sort of realized that the physics of avalanches and how they happen is more or less well understood at this point. However, people continue to get killed in avalanches. And almost every time when we look at it in hindsight, there's some clear red flags that were missed or were ignored, or so it's the human factors and the decision making that is often the bigger part of these incidents. And so I think the shift towards that in the avalanche industry is warranted, and you see a lot more work come out now about why we make the decisions we do that it wasn't there before, and I think that's why.
Well, Dan, this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much for sharing all of that and role modeling how being vulnerable and talking about our own experiences can encourage and make a safe space for others to do the same. And I think you've just done that even more so by being on our podcast today. So really want to thank you. And thanks to all of you for listening. Remember, despite the show's title, we can be lucky and good, but relying on luck is not a risk management strategy. So like Dan did today, let's keep sharing our stories so others can benefit from them. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe. And if you'd like to be a guest on our show and come share your story, please check out how to do that at luckyOrGoodPodcast.com. Thanks for listening.